Hi everyone, today we're going to be unlocking the ADHD puzzle, a vibrant exploration of GABA and glutamate dynamics. And while October marks ADHD Awareness Month, it is never too late to bring more awareness to this disorder. And today we'll be talking about ADHD as well as what roles GABA and glutamate play in it. GABA and glutamate are two important neurotransmitters located in our brain. So let's begin by learning about them and what they do. So what exactly are neurotransmitters? Well, they are chemical messengers of the brain. Their job is to pass on messages from one neuron to the next. To release the neurotransmitters, an action potential will move down the axon and into the neuron terminal. The action potential will make the terminal more positive because sodium ions are flowing in. The positive change in the terminal allows calcium channels to open and let calcium ions flow in. This signals the vesicles to fuse with the membrane and dump the neurotransmitters out into the space between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. The neurotransmitters move across the space and bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Then the receptors, which can be ion channels, will open to let ions flow in and change the neuron to be more or less positive, which may or may not lead to an action potential. We can also think of this whole process in terms of delivering mail. Our neurons are like the postal office, where mail is processed and sorted. The neurotransmitters are like the mailman that takes the mail. The action potential is loading the delivery truck. Based on how much mail is loaded, the truck may or may not leave the postal office. Some of the more specific neurotransmitters we'll talk about today will be glutamate and GABA. These two neurotransmitters are important in keeping our brain functioning correctly. GABA stands for GABA aminobutyric acid, and together with glutamate, they are considered major excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters in our brain. They're typically released from GABAergic and glutamatergic neurons. More specifically, GABAergic neurons use GABA, or the most abundant inhibitory neurotransmitter. Inhibitory means that it makes it less likely for the postsynaptic neuron to fire action potential. What happens is that GABA will bind to the GABA receptors on the postsynaptic neuron membrane. These receptors are also ion channels, and they will open to let chloride flow in. Chloride ions are negatively charged, so they will make the neuron more negative, making it harder to reach the tipping point and fire an action potential. On the other hand, glutamatergic neurons use glutamate, or the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter. Excitatory means that action potential is more likely to occur. What happens is that glutamate will bind to the glutamate receptors, and these receptors are also ion channels. The channels will open to let sodium flow in and potassium flow out. The balance between sodium and potassium flow will make the neuron more positive, making it easier to reach the tipping point and fire an action potential.
GABAergic and glutamatergic are antagonistic to each other, but they are also coworkers because they keep a perfect balance of inhibitory and excitatory signals. You can think of it as like the three branches of government that operate on a checks and balance system. GABAergic neurons sometimes will check on glutamatergic neurons by releasing GABA to act on the receptors on the neurons. And if the inhibitory effect of GABA is strong enough, then no action potential would occur, so glutamatergic neurons will not release glutamate. This could lead to lower glutamate levels in our brain, which might lead to difficulty maintaining focus or attention. On the other hand, glutamatergic neurons will also check on GABAergic neurons by releasing glutamate to act on glutamate receptors on the neurons. And if the excitatory effects are strong enough, then an action potential would fire, and GABAergic neurons will release GABA. However, we need to keep in mind that there are a variety of receptors located on the neurons, and depending on the receptors, we could see different changes in the release of the neurotransmitters. Of course, GABAergic and glutamatergic neurons can act on the same neuron. In this case, whichever effect is greater determines whether an action potential would fire. So, for example, if the inhibitory effects of GABA are greater than the excitatory effects of glutamate, then an action potential might not happen. The communication between neurons ends there and leads to a decrease in brain activity. That is why sometimes we might be focused, but somehow we lose our attention control. Now, in our brain, we have a variety of neurons, but we will focus on the two neurons we mentioned, GABAergic and glutamatergic neurons. These two neurons are part of circuits that connect different parts of our brain together. One of the major circuits is called the cortical striatal thalamocortical circuit, or CSTC circuit. We will explain the circuit in more detail later in the video, so stay tuned. But as we are going through the video, remember that there cannot be too many inhibitory or too many excitatory signals, otherwise we would see changes in our behaviors. For example, inability to stay focused, difficulty controlling emotion, or hyperactivity, and they are common to neurodevelopmental disorders. In fact, there is a disorder that affects people in the States and worldwide, which we know as ADHD.
ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a wide range of symptoms. These symptoms include inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, which can differ in severity and change over time. ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders among children. However, even though it is commonly diagnosed in kids, the symptoms usually persist into adulthood. Children with ADHD often exhibit hyperactivity and or impulsive behaviors. But as they mature, hyperactivity symptoms usually start declining, and inattention starts to emerge and persist into adulthood. As ADHD awareness has increased since the start of the century, so has the prevalence of the diagnosis. With the number of cases on the rise, this has become an extremely popular research area for scientists. Typically, adults who have ADHD have trouble with tasks that require them to hold their attention and inhibit their impulsive behaviors. Scientists used a large amount of attention control tasks to observe whether there were differences between those with ADHD and healthy individuals. For example, the flanker test is used to measure the ability to suppress distracting information while maintaining focus on a specific target. The participants of the study were asked to look at a line of arrows. The congruent condition is where all the arrows are facing the same direction, and participants are asked to identify which direction is the most center arrow facing. While the incongruent condition is where arrows were facing different directions, and again, the participants were asked to identify the direction the most center arrow was facing. From what we can see, ADHD patients exhibit significantly more errors while monitoring arrow direction while blocking out the excess information that was present. Due to the symptoms, such as the inability to stay focused and impulsive tendencies, we need to take a closer look at regions and circuits of the brain that control these functions. There are many regions of the brain that can be and are affected by ADHD, and their interactions with each other are crucial for how the rest of the brain functions. For example, the regions of the prefrontal cortex, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC for short, these regions are responsible for the executive functions of the brain, such as impulsive control, attention, emotion regulation, working memory, and decision making. Another important region is the striatum, which is a part of the basal ganglia. As part of the striatum is the caudate nucleus, or the CN for short. It consists of attention control, reward processing, and motivation. And finally, the thalamus, which is known as the sensory relay station of the brain. It has extensive neuronal circuitry with cortical regions of the brain and plays an important role in regulating selective attention of visual and auditory information. There are tons of complex circuits of neurons that act as highways to send information to each region of the brain. More specifically, the circuits we are interested in are known as the CSTC circuit, which connects the prefrontal cortex to the striatum and then to the thalamus. Finally, the thalamus is connected back to the prefrontal cortex to create a complete feedback loop. This circuit is used for a variety of functions, but the ones we will focus on today is its use for the selective and sustained attention, which people with ADHD have trouble with. So, the question is, could this possibly be due to a lower activation of these neuronal circuits?
Well, the meta-analysis study conducted by Dick Stein and his team provides evidence of a consistent pattern of frontal hypoactivity in patients with ADHD compared to the control group across 16 peer-reviewed neuroimaging studies. The frontal hypoactivity is noted in patients with ADHD and is widely distributed across many areas of the frontal region, as we can see in this figure. In the top row, we have the control group, and we can see the three different planes. On the left side is the frontal lobe, and we have these orange dots here that represent that this part of the brain is active. And then in the middle is the medial wall, and again, we see the orange dots. And the right side is the right side striatum, and we see the orange dots again representing that this part of the brain is active. If we move on to the second row, it's still the frontal lobe, medial wall, and right side striatum. But if we look at the frontal lobe, we don't really see the dots as we did in the control. And then if we look at the medial wall, we can see this really bright orange dot showing that there is a lot of activity here. And then the right side striatum in ADHD group, we don't see much activity. The last row is for the overlap of the control group and the ADHD group. So we can see that in the frontal lobe, it's mainly just the control group, and we don't see the ADHD group. And then in the medial wall, we can see that the orange dots here, these are all for the control group. And then this pink dot here represents the ADHD. And then on the right side striatum, we only see the control group again. And so this suggests that lower activity in the brain region for ADHD could mean that there is a deficit in the circuit.
Now, let's look at a recent study conducted by Mamie and colleagues that provides strong evidence of problems with attention control in people with ADHD may be related to insufficient responses in our CSTC circuitry. Their overall goal is to measure the glutamate plus glutamine, or GLX, and GABA content in the two important regions of the circuit, the ACC and the CN, while participants performed attention control tasks. In this study, there were a total of 34 adult participants. 18 of them were clinically diagnosed with ADHD, while the other 16 were the control groups. Each participant was placed into a fancy machine known as magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS for short, which is a tool that is used to measure the concentration of certain chemicals in complex samples such as glutamate and GABA in the specific regions of the brain. Researchers observed the neurotransmitter content of participants when they were at rest and while they were performing attention control tasks in the MRS machine. All the measurements were taken and then put side to side for comparison in both the control and ADHD participants. Here is our own drawing of the results. At rest, which is shown by the orange horizontal line in our drawing, we can see that there is no significant increase or decrease in the concentration of GABA and glutamate from the controls to those with ADHD. This means at rest, the GABA and glutamate levels are the same among the regions of the brain for these participants. Now that we have established that, let's specifically focus on what happens when the participants were active in the attention control tasks. As we can see that with the GABA levels, there is a significant increase from the normal individuals, shown with a large arrow. On the contrary, the GABA levels for the individuals with ADHD has a significantly smaller increase, which is shown by the smaller arrow. Now, if we look at glutamate levels, we can see similar results. There is a more significant increase in the glutamate levels of healthy individuals, whereas individuals with ADHD had a significantly smaller increase in glutamate levels. Again, the arrows of the drawing show the differences between the two groups. So, how does this all tie into our CSTC circuits that we briefly mentioned earlier? Well, let's start with the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, which will receive glutamate signals and gets excited. This causes the prefrontal cortex to send glutamate signals to either the DLFPC or the ACC, which then is excited and glutamate signals will be sent to the striatum, either the inferior striatum or the CN. However, instead of releasing excitatory neurotransmitters, it releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA, to act on GPI, which is short for globulus pallidus internus. This is an interesting part of the circuit because GPI acts as an inhibitor of the thalamus. So, when you inhibit the inhibitor, you actually cause the opposite effect and cause the thalamus to be stimulated further. Thus, the thalamus completes the loop and sends excitatory glutamate to act on the PFC, so the cycle starts completely over again. When we need to focus our attention on a specific task, the circuit is upregulated and causes higher activity and stimulation of these crucial regions of the brain needed for our attention. The regulation of these circuits allows us to have flexible attention. What we just explained is the sense of a normal brain circuit. What about the circuitry for ADHD? Well, from what we know about the loop, we can assume that if there's a break between any part of the loop, the entire circuit is affected. The attention will not hold for long and basically snaps. To make this clear, let's think of Christmas tree lights. If one of these lights does not get enough power and goes out, then there's a domino effect, and all of the lights following it go out as well. This is what might be happening in our brain circuit. The lower power input is the lower neurotransmitter signaling, and the regions of the brain are the lights. If not enough neurotransmitter or power reaches a specific brain region or light, then we will not be able to properly activate this region and it will not be able to do its job, and thus affect our entire circuit. As we can see from the study, the lack of increase in neurotransmitter content in both the ACC and the CN is evident in people with ADHD during these attention control tasks. Going back to our CSTC circuit, we see that the ACC is an important relay region of the cortex, and the CN is another important region of the striatum. The lack of increase in glutamate in the ACC and the cortex could explain low glutaminergic signaling from the thalamus. In turn, the low excitatory signaling can lead to a low cortex stimulation and thus cause a decrease in excitatory signaling to the striatum as well. We can see a lack of increase in GABA and glutamate in the CN. As we know, if the striatum is not stimulated, it cannot release GABA to inhibit the inhibitor, and thus GPI will inhibit the thalamus and not allow excitatory signaling to be sent back to the cortex. This completes our loop, and we are back to the beginning with low cortex activation. In conclusion, we learned today that GABA and glutamate are two important neurotransmitters in the brain that play key roles in the regulation of our CSTC circuits. The CSTC circuits are a series of neuronal pathways that play a crucial role in various cognitive, limbic, and motor functions. A smaller increase in the levels of neurotransmitter content is a plausible reason for the observed hypoactivity within the circuit that has been shown to cause behavior issues for neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and possibly even others. Although we still have so much more to learn, the knowledge of how all this works is key for the development of a possible future cure.
Special thanks to Dr. Zhang for advice and comments. Also, a shout out to our class for providing awesome feedback. I hope the video was informative. Thanks for tuning in.